Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to the weekly broadcast of Strategic Speaking for Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and my guest today is Judy Ravin of Accents International. I'm so happy to have a live guest. It's not just me. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I am thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. When I was recording the podcast episode called Second Language, First Impression, how do you speak well if English is not your first language?
Yes.
Or if you're speaking to people for whom English is not their first language, how do you actually do that? And I realized I had to talk about accent reduction, which you say is not actually accent reduction. It's more better pronunciation, right?
That is a perfect definition. Accent reduction is quite a misnomer. Really, if anything, it's not accent reduction, it's accent acquisition. We are learning how to pronounce the sounds in one language that doesn't exist in the speaker's first language. And yes, accent for our purposes really means pronunciation. Accent and pronunciation, in terms of regular everyday usage, it's more or less the same for our discussion here.
Okay. The reason I was so excited to have you here is because I've got a couple of people that I turn to, and you're one of the main ones, for those who really need to deal with the barrier of not being understood. So the official bio is Judy Ravin is the president and founder of Accents International, LLC. She's also the author of a best-selling software-based learning systems for rapid language acquisition. She's dedicated to minimizing communication barriers in a global workforce while maintaining each person's unique cultural identity. She's earned international recognition for helping Fortune 100 corporations create high-performance teams where everybody is heard and everybody excels. I love it that you're talking about international, really language acquisition and keeping people's cultural identity. Before I start, let me ask you, why does it matter?
Great question. So the goal, the objective, why is language created? It's so that the speaker and the listener can understand one another effectively, so that they can either collaborate to achieve a joint objective or even just to share information. So the speaker and the listener understand one another. And all of language is based on three pillars that make it work. The first is vocabulary, so that a word has a shared meaning between the speaker and the listener. The second is grammar, its usage, the way that we use the word, so its meaning, the difference between I walk and yesterday I walked. Now we have a sense of what that means. And pronunciation. So for example, in Korean where the F doesn't exist, that sound, it's important perhaps to learn that so that we can say defend rather than depend. And there are so many examples like that, so that we can use syllable stress correctly. For example, an object is a person, place, or thing. To object means to say no. Two different ways to pronounce a word, two very different meanings. Pronunciation is essential in every language. The rules are made up. It's not like, the laws of nature, gravity, for example. The rules change. It's not good. It's not bad. It's made up. It's a question of being effective. And that's why I believe pronunciation matters. I learned this from being on the other side of the street. This was 7 years ago when I lived in France. And when I went to France, pre-touchdown, pre-landing, I thought that my French was great. I'd have no problem being understood. I mean, not perfect by any means, but effective. And what I found out is that when people kept asking me, and they did frequently, what? What did you say? Can you repeat that? And they sincerely asked. I really had a hard time being understood. My vocabulary, I was using the right words. Grammar, I was using the right words in the right way. But I hadn't learned French pronunciation, so I wasn't being effective. Now, I think you were asking, why does it matter in the workforce, in the workplace?
So part of the reason why I wanted to do this is because you and I have both seen many cases where someone who's really smart and can write really well has a hard time being understood when they speak.
Oh, Elizabeth, we've seen this. I've been doing this for over 25 years now. So we've seen myself and our faculty, thousands of cases where people are experts in their field, very competent in their field, but the communication is holding them back from advancing. Why? Because communication is key. I mean, communication really is the currency of our global economy. And research shows two things. One, that if someone isn't easily understood, there is an unconscious judgment that their message isn't as credible. Not that the person isn't or credible, but the message is not as credible. That's been proven over and over and over and over again, whether it be at the Max Planck Institute or it was actually really seminal research at the University of Chicago, the Department of Linguistics. Why? Because when the brain has to work so hard to decipher meaning, our brain goes like this. Not so sure. So
Too much work.
Too much work. It's true if we read blurred text. Too much work. It's true if the grammar is off. Too much work. The message isn't as credible. And that sadly is an unconscious accent bias that really has nothing to do about judgment about a person.
When we were talking about this earlier, I was thinking it's like the audio equivalent of if somebody sends you a business proposal and a written proposal and it's full of typos and grammatical errors, you're going to make a judgment about the credibility of what they're offering. If they can't spell right, then that's a problem.
It absolutely. And sadly, what do we do when we see that? We either laugh or we go, or something. Our brain does that. It pushes the message away, regrettably, because people have important things to say. And in business, you get a seat at the table when you are heard.
Yes.
If you can't be heard, we don't get a seat at the table, whatever table that is. Shall I give you an example?
I was just going to ask, you were talking about some biochemists that you were working with. Yeah. Very smart people, right?
Oh my goodness gracious. I mean, they could run and did run circles around me. My pronunciation in English might have been better, but wow, their expertise in biochemistry was phenomenal. So these were a group of 12 biochemists at a subsidiary of DuPont called Pioneer Hybrid. Okay. And they were all they were part of their succession plan at DuPont to move up into leadership positions, to lead teams. Why? Because they were brilliant, but they couldn't lead a team if they couldn't really be understood.
That's where were they from?
All of them were from China.
Okay.
So Chinese is their first language.
Okay.
So generally speaking, I don't need to go on site. In fact, all of our training is online remotely. We need to see their mouth and they need to see ours. But in this case, I was on site at their headquarters to meet with leadership of the company, and I met them. They were excited to take the program. Great. They took the program. It's a 10-session program. At the end, they did phenomenally well. They mastered the sounds in English that don't occur in Chinese, and they could convey their messages. The next year, literally 1 year later, I visited again headquarters. I met with leadership again, and they had leadership had organized a luncheon for me to reconnect with those 12 learners from the previous year. Elizabeth, they had all become VPs of this and VPs of that and director of this and manager of that.
They'd all been promoted.
They had all been promoted. The only thing that had been keeping them back was their accent or pronunciation.
So that's a very important story. You've said a few times, English is hard to pronounce, and yes. I can certainly understand that. But give us some examples for those of our listeners who learned English as babies, and so they didn't, they take it for granted.
Yes, yes. Oh boy, I can give you so many examples. And I'd like to start by saying, for people who speak English as an additional language, AKA a second language,
or third.
Yes. It's not the person. It's the language. English is as you had called it, a mishmash. English is messy and it's illogical.
And that's
because there isn't one letter in English that is pronounced in only one way. Not one. Even B, for example, ba, is silent in so many different examples when it follows M, climb, thumb, bomb. But let's take the vowels. Sure, there are 5, we could consider Y makes 6 vowels. In terms of letters, there are 21 vowel sounds in English. What?
I used to teach diction to Italian yes. diction to opera singers. And you always start with Italian because there were only 5 vowels and only 7 sounds. I didn't realize there were 21 in English.
There are. Well, the letter O itself makes up about 7 of them. Some people say 8. One of the least common pronunciations for the letter O is O, like no, go.
Yeah, okay.
Right, but we take no and we add a W to it, and then we get now, except when you add a K before the N-O-W, and then it stays with no. So what is a person to do? The most common vowel sound for the letter O is actually like some and love and done. Done, O-N-E, one O-N-E, but not gone, G-O-N-E. Awe doesn't exist in most other languages, but it's everywhere in English. Long, wrong, gone. By the way, awe is also O-U-G-H, like, I can't think of one right now.
Yeah.
Cough.
Yeah.
Then the second most common is as in profit. Oh, how is this? A profit or loss. They're both O. That's what non-native English speakers are up against. It's not the person, it's the language. So when I say English pronunciation is hard, that's why I think it's hard. That's why it's never the speaker, it's the language.
I often think that this has to do with English. In some ways, it's a very low context language.
Yes.
Because English has been formed by so many other languages.
Yes.
As part of it. It is a mishmash because so many different roots of languages.
Sure.
And American English, especially because America was colonized by Europeans
Yes.
from many, 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 many different native languages. So in English, you have to be very direct.
Yes.
Because it is assumed that the people you're talking with do not have the same cultural background as you do.
Correct. Yes, correct.
And as opposed to the Japanese who, quote, read the air, unquote, because if you've all grown up in Japan, everybody knows what you're talking about.
Oh, if only I could do that. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I'm always interested in the background of things. But let me go back to one of the things I wanted to ask you, which is, if English is hard to pronounce, can't you just listen and repeat?
Oh, great question. That is a great question. So English is hard to pronounce if it's not your first language. Children learn pronunciation of every language in a different way than adults learn pronunciation. So adults, it's not a question of listen and repeat. Children are much more able to do that. Adults, while English pronunciation is hard, if you don't have training in it, it is learnable. And here's the methodology. It is not a listen and repeat. It is, this is going to sound counterintuitive, Elizabeth, or like an oxymoron, but what does a sound look like? What does a sound feel like?
Oh,
for example,
that's interesting.
TH. TH. The tip of the tongue sticks out between your teeth. Like it looks like. What does it feel like? You can feel air moving over your tongue as it's sort of vibrating or pushing through. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Adult learners, when they recognize that, often it's crazy cool. Often, then they can hear it. First, they see how it looks, then how it feels, and then they can self-correct. It's amazing. I believe that we are hardwired for language acquisition. Our species, humanity, depends on it.
Yes.
On oral communication. So we can learn pronunciation as adults, but we learn it differently.
I'm thinking about the difference between a voiced TH,
yes,
like other,
yes,
and a non-voiced TH, like say path.
Great. So how do we
or pathway
feel the difference of these two sounds? If we take our two fingers and we put it on our vocal cords or just the base of your throat, and we pronounce it voiceless, like
pathway,
we'll notice that the vocal cords stop moving. Pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the example that you gave of a voiced
other?
TH?
Other.
We'll notice that the voice vocal cords, the voice box, keeps moving. We can feel the difference.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody, if you are just listening to the audio, do yourself a favor and go back and watch the video of this, because she just showed us a fascinating technique that could be very helpful. When you talk about learning this, you went back, you told me earlier, the story of Korean.
Yes.
Which doesn't have the F sound.
Yes.
Didn't you have a Korean client who was having trouble with that?
We were working with NATO, actually.
NATO, okay. Yeah.
We were working with the Allied Command Forces. And we were working with a general from Korea who had told us about a story when he had been working through an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interpreter, by international law, has to interpret word for word. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to say, actually, he had been speaking in English, but the interpreter still broadcasted it louder. And
In
he had
English?
said, yes,
Yeah, okay.
excuse me.
Yes.
And he said, tell them they can, what was it? Tell them to defend us. But it came out to depend on us. Very different meaning.
Because instead of the F sound in English, they use the P sound.
Right. And defend, he was saying to the others to take action, but defend us, but the interpreter told them they can depend on us, meaning the Korean troops would be the ones taking the action. It switched it around.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, it was a joint maneuver, so there weren't, critical consequences, but it was unnerving and it put them behind. Mm-hmm.
I see. So that's a very interesting description. Going back to the workforce, when somebody is having trouble being understood,
yes,
why don't they ask for help?
Oh, this is a great question. I think there are two reasons. One is that they are leery and hesitant in a belief that it could make them lose their cultural identity, of which people are very proud. And I believe we all should be proud of our linguistic identity. Mm-hmm. There is a difference, however, between accent reduction, we like to call it English pronunciation training, as you know, and accent elimination. Accent reduction is more about acquiring the sounds that don't exist in someone's first language. People will still have an accent. What they won't have is a communication barrier.
But that's very important.
Yeah, thank you. But people are hesitant. They're afraid that, oh no, I could eliminate my accent. I don't want to lose my... There are people that do accent elimination. I don't know how successful they are, but we don't. And there is really a distinction between the two. So it's possible to get help and maintain your unique cultural identity. Our program and many others are 10 sessions, 12 sessions. Really, no program should be more than 15 sessions. It doesn't take that long.
You just have to invest in yourself.
Right. And practice 10, 15 minutes a day, because we are changing the muscle memory of our mouth, our speech apparatus. But it doesn't take hundreds of hours and you'll get accent elimination. We don't need to be afraid of losing our accent when we reach out for help. The other thing is, and I think this speaks to your question about the difference in methodology, how do adults learn, is that listen and repeat doesn't work. And often that's how people are taught. Listen, repeat, listen, repeat. It doesn't work. So there's a feeling out there that, oh, this isn't going to work. Why would I spend time and money on something that doesn't work? If you're looking for accent reduction services or training, I would ask people, what is your methodology? What is your methodology? Listen and repeat. It's not going to cut it for an adult.
Let me ask this question a different way. Say you have a new manager who has been brought in because of how smart they are and how smart their writing is.
Yeah.
And but they're really hard to understand.
Yes.
How can you politely, gracefully say, I get help. I can't understand you. This isn't going to work.
Perfect question. And by the way, if you'd like to share these answers with your audience, we have a 1 paragraph, let's call it talking template, talking points that we like to give people so that they can really have this conversation. Because the last thing that we want to do is to put the blame on the person. It's not the person, it's the language. And we don't want it to be unempowering. We want to empower people so they can have this training. Well, one thing I would do is I would acknowledge that English is really difficult. And I would acknowledge that, wow, it's not the person, it's the language. And we can give a few examples. We can also refer, ask that person or mention that, Hindi is your first language. I can guarantee you that your English is so much better than my Hindi.
Mm-hmm.
We happen to be working in English. If we were working in Hindi, that would be a big problem for me. I don't know, whatever. English pronunciation is hard. Here's a communication training program to not eliminate an accent, but rather to acquire the sounds in English that don't exist in other languages, so you can be as effective as possible in the language that we're working in. Not in our language, not in English, in the language that we're working in. We are all in this together.
We will post in the comments, we'll post information about how to find this and where we can find that. Could you leave us with one tip, one thing that we could do to get started?
Yes. So one thing I would do is to read, if English is not your first language. Is that?
Yes.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Read one email a day out loud, making sure to pronounce the last sound of each word.
Uh-huh.
And if you can feel it, they can hear it. Feel yourself pronouncing that sound at the end of each word, your listener can hear it. If there are sounds that are difficult to pronounce, I would say seek training. It's not a huge investment in time, and it will transform your communication and hopefully your world as well.
Well, Judy Ravin, thank you so very much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thank you for having me. I hope that it was helpful. Thank you for having me.
It was incredibly helpful and incredibly useful. How can we find out more? How do we find you?
Well, I would love to hear from you. Our website is Accents, plural, ACCENTS, International, Accents International, and we are a .org. accentsinternational.org, and people are welcome to contact me directly at Judy, Judy, at accentsinternational.org. If I can support you or your listenership, your audience, I'd love to.
Thank you so much. This has been really useful, really helpful. This has been the weekly broadcast of Strategic Speaking for Results. My guest was Judy Ravin, as you've just heard. I'm Elizabeth Bachman. Thank you so much for joining us. I will see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.